Chapter 1. The Outcast. The morning sun cast long shadows across the rocky terrain of the Colorado Territory as Ayanna knelt beside the dying embers of what had once been her family's fire. The ashes were cold now, just like the looks her own people had given her before they rode away at dawn, leaving her behind with nothing but the clothes on her back and a heavy heart full of shame. Weak, Chief Running Bear had declared, his weathered face showing no trace of the man who had once bounced her on his knee. The winter ahead will be harsh. We cannot afford to carry those who cannot hunt, cannot fight, cannot contribute to the survival of our people. Ayanna's hands trembled as she gathered the few possessions they had deemed worthless enough to leave behind: a cracked water gourd, a torn blanket, and the beaded necklace her grandmother had made before the fever took her. At 19, she should have been one of the strongest women in their small band of Cheyenne, but a childhood illness had left her lungs weak and her body frail. While other girls her age could run for miles and carry heavy loads, Ayanna struggled to keep up during their seasonal migrations. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made her freeze. She pressed herself against the rocks, knowing that being discovered alone could mean capture, slavery, or worse. The stories of what happened to lone Native women in these territories were told in hushed whispers around the fires. "Easy, girl," a deep voice called out in English. "I'm not here to hurt you." Ayanna peered around the boulder and saw a man dismounting from a dusty brown horse. He was tall, probably in his mid-20s, with sun-weathered skin and kind eyes, the color of autumn leaves. His clothes marked him as a cowboy-worn leather chaps, a faded blue shirt, and a hat that had seen better days. What struck her most was how he kept his hands visible, making no move toward the gun at his hip. "You speak English?" he asked, removing his hat and running a hand through his dark hair. Ayanna nodded slowly. The missionaries who had visited their camp several summers ago had taught her much to her father's disapproval. "Name's Jake Morrison," he said, squatting down to her level. "I was tracking some cattle rustlers when I saw the smoke from your fire. Looks like whoever was here left in a hurry." "They left me," Ayanna whispered, the words scraping against her throat like sandpaper. Jake's expression softened. "Your people," she nodded, unable to meet his eyes. The shame burned in her chest like a brand. "Well," Jake said after a moment, "that's their loss." He stood and walked back to his horse, returning with a canteen. "You look like you could use some water." Ayanna accepted the canteen gratefully, the cool water soothing her parched throat. As she drank, she noticed Jake studying the terrain with the practiced eye of someone who knew these mountains well. "Storm's coming," he said, pointing toward the darkening clouds gathering on the horizon. "This isn't a place to weather it alone. There's a line shack, about 10 miles north. It's not much, but it's got 4 walls and a roof." "Why would you help me?" Ayanna asked, suspicion creeping into her voice. In her experience, white men rarely showed kindness to her people without expecting something in return. Jake was quiet for a moment, his gaze distant. "Had a sister once. She was different, couldn't walk properly from birth. People used to stare, whisper, made her feel like she was worth less than nothing." He looked directly at Ayanna. "Nobody deserves to be thrown away like that." The sincerity in his voice caught her off guard. She had expected lies, false promises, or worse. Instead, she found herself looking into the eyes of someone who understood what it meant to be cast aside. "I cannot ride," she admitted, gesturing to her worn moccasins. "My people took the horses." "That's all right," Jake said simply. "We'll take it slow." As they began walking, Ayanna struggled to keep pace, despite Jake's considerate speed. Her breathing became labored, and she found herself stopping frequently to rest. Each pause filled her with fresh shame, reinforcing everything her tribe had said about her being a burden. "I'm sorry," she gasped during one such stop. "I told you I was weak." Jake turned to face her, and for a moment, she thought she saw anger flash in his eyes. But when he spoke, his voice was gentle. "You're not weak. You're still here, aren't you? Still fighting. That takes more strength than most people have." Thunder rumbled overhead, and the first drops of rain began to fall. Jake looked at the darkening sky, then at Ayanna, who was already shivering despite the warm day. "Come on," he said, extending his hand. "Let's get you somewhere safe." Chapter 2. The shelter the line shack was exactly as Jake had described: a small, weathered cabin that had seen better days but offered solid protection from the elements. As the storm unleashed its fury outside, Jake worked to start a fire in the stone hearth while Ayanna huddled in the corner, wrapped in his spare blanket. "There's some canned goods in the pantry," Jake said, coaxing flames from the kindling. "Nothing fancy, but it'll keep us fed until the storm passes." Ayanna watched him work, noting how his hands moved with practiced efficiency. Everything about him spoke of competence and self-reliance, qualities her people valued above all else. It only served to highlight her own perceived inadequacies. "Why do you live out here?" she asked, partly to distract herself from her own thoughts. Jake settled back on his heels, watching the fire catch. "Family ranch went under about 5 years ago. Been working cattle drives and odd jobs ever since. Trying to save enough to start." "For," he glanced at her. "What about you, besides the obvious?" Ayanna pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. I was born during the harsh winter. My mother said I came too early, too small. The medicine woman said I would not survive my first season. She paused, staring into the flames. Perhaps she was right. You're still here, Jake pointed out. That counts for something. My people do not think so. I cannot hunt like my cousins. I cannot gather roots and berries for long distances. During raids, I must be protected instead of fighting. Her voice dropped to a whisper. I am useless to them. Jake stood and walked to the small window, looking out at the rain lashing against the glass. You know what I see when I look at you? Ayana shook her head. Someone who's survived 19 years in one of the harshest places on Earth. Someone who learned a foreign language because she was curious about the world. Someone who's still got enough fight left in her to be sitting here talking to me instead of giving up back there in the rocks. You do not know me, Ayana said. Quietly, maybe not, but I know what giving up looks like, and you're not it. The storm raged through the night, and Jake slept by the fire while Ayana took the cabin's single cot. She lay awake listening to the thunder, thinking about his words. No one had ever spoken to her that way before, not with pity or frustration, but with something that felt almost like respect. When morning came, the air was crisp and clean, washed by the storm. Jake was already up, preparing coffee over the fire. Feeling better? He asked. Handing her a cup, Ayana nodded, though she wasn't sure if he meant physically or emotionally. Both perhaps. I've been thinking, Jake said, settling down across from her. I'm heading to Denver in a few days. Got a job lined up at a ranch outside the city. They're looking for help with the books, correspondence, that sort of thing. Someone who can read and write. Ayana looked at him with confusion. I do not understand. You can read and write, can't you? In English. The missionaries taught me, yes. But you're exactly what they need, Jake interrupted. Mr. Patterson, who runs the ranch, is getting on in years. His eyesight isn't what it used to be, and his handwriting is getting shaky. He needs someone sharp, someone he can trust. He would not want someone like me. Why? Because you're Cheyenne. Patterson's not like that. He judges people by their character, not their bloodline. Jake leaned forward. Look, I'm not saying it would be easy. There are plenty of folks in Denver who wouldn't take kindly to you, but there are good people too, and you'd have a roof over your head, regular meals, honest work. Ayana stared into her coffee, her mind racing. The offer was more generous than anything she had dared hope for, but it also terrified her. Living among white people, trying to fit into their world, it seemed impossible. What if I cannot do it? She asked. What if I am too weak for their work as well? Jake was quiet for a moment. Then we'll figure something else out. But you'll never know unless you try. The words hung between them like a challenge. Ayana thought of her grandmother's stories about the old days, when their people had been free to roam the Great Plains. Those days were gone, possibly forever. Maybe it was time to find a new way to be strong. I will try, she said finally. Jake smiled, and for the first time since her people had abandoned her, Ayana felt something that might have been hope. Chapter 3. The journey, the trail to Denver, wound through some of the most treacherous terrain in the Colorado Territory. What should have been a 3-day journey stretched into 5, as Jake accommodated Ayana's limitations, never once complaining about their slow pace. On the second day, as they climbed higher into the mountains, Ayana's breathing became increasingly labored. She tried to hide it, but Jake noticed everything. Let's rest, he said, dismounting from his horse. I can continue, Ayana protested, though she was grateful for the pause. I know you can, but even the strongest horses need rest in this thin air. They found a sheltered spot among the rocks, and Jake shared his water and jerky while Ayana tried to calm her racing heart. The altitude was affecting her more than she wanted to admit, and the weight of being a burden pressed down on her like a physical thing. Tell me about your family, Jake said, settling beside her. Ayana was surprised by the question. Why do you want to know? Because you're more than just your struggles. Everyone has a story. She was quiet for a moment, then began to speak. My father was a great warrior. He counted coup on 20 enemies and never lost a single battle. My mother was known for her beadwork. Women from other tribes would trade horses for her designs. She paused. They were proud people. I brought them shame. How? By being weak. By needing protection instead of providing it. By surviving when stronger children did not. The words came out more bitter than she intended. Jake was quiet for a long moment. You know what I think? I think they were afraid. Afraid of what? Of losing you? Of watching you struggle and not being able to fix it? Sometimes it's easier to push someone away than to watch them suffer. Ayana had never considered this perspective. It didn't excuse what her people had done, but it added a layer of complexity to their actions that made them seem less like rejection and more like desperate self-preservation. Your sister, she said carefully, the one who could not walk. What happened to her? Jake's expression grew distant. Fever took her when she was 12, but before that, she was the happiest person I knew. She'd sit on the porch and watch the sunset every single night, finding beauty in things the rest of us took for granted. He looked at Ayana. She taught me that strength isn't always about what you can do. Sometimes it's about how you choose to see the world. That night, they camped under a canopy of stars that seemed close enough to touch. Ayana lay in her bedroll, thinking about Jake's words. She had spent so long focusing on her limitations that she had forgotten to consider her strengths. The languages she spoke, the skills she had learned, the perspective she had gained from living on the margins, maybe, these things had value too. The third day brought new challenges. The trail narrowed, forcing them to lead Jake's horse while navigating treacherous switchbacks. Ayana's legs began to shake from the effort, and she found herself stopping more frequently. "I cannot," she gasped, during one particularly difficult stretch. "I am holding you back." Without a word, Jake handed her his horse's reins and knelt down with his back to her. "What are you doing?" she asked. "Giving you a ride. Come on. I cannot let you carry me. I am too heavy, and you will tire." Jake looked over his shoulder at her. "Lady, I've carried full-grown calves through mud deeper than you are tall. You're not going to break me." Asterisk reluctantly, Ayana climbed onto his back. Jake stood with ease, adjusting her weight until she was comfortable, then began walking. To her amazement, his pace barely slowed. "This is not right," she said quietly. "You should not have to carry me." "Says who?" "Your tribe. The people who abandoned you," says everyone. "I am a burden." Jake stopped walking and turned his head to look at her. "You know what a burden is? A burden is something that serves no purpose, something that only takes and never gives. You're not a burden, Ayana. You're a person who needs help sometimes. There's a difference." As they continued up the mountain, Ayana found herself seeing the landscape from a new perspective, literally and figuratively. From Jake's shoulders, she could see farther across the valleys and peaks. But more than that, she began to understand that needing help didn't diminish her worth as a person. "Jake," she said softly. "Yeah, thank you." "For what?" "For showing me that I am not what they said I was." Jake's grip on her legs tightened slightly. "You never were." Chapter 4. The new dawn Denver was unlike anything Ayana had ever seen. The streets bustled with activity, horses and wagons creating a constant din that made her ears ring. Buildings rose higher than any structure she had ever imagined, and the sheer number of people overwhelmed her senses. "Stay close," Jake said, noticing her wide-eyed stare. "It's a lot to take in at first." They made their way through the crowded streets to the outskirts of town, where the Patterson Ranch sprawled across rolling hills. The main house was a modest but well-maintained structure, with a large barn and several outbuildings scattered around the property. Thomas Patterson was a man in his 60s, with silver hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. He greeted Jake warmly, then turned his attention to Ayana with curiosity rather than suspicion. "So, you're the young lady Jake's been telling me about," he said. "He says you're quite skilled with letters and numbers." Ayana nodded nervously. "I will work hard, Mr. Patterson. I'm sure you will." "Jake's never brought me anyone who wasn't worth their salt." He gestured toward the house. "Come on, let me show you around." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of adjustment. Ayana learned to navigate the complexities of ranch bookkeeping, corresponded with buyers and suppliers, and gradually found her place in the small community of ranch hands and their families. It wasn't always easiest. Some people stared, others whispered, and a few made their disapproval known. But Jake's prediction proved correct. There were good people too, and they far outnumbered the bad. Mrs. Patterson, Thomas's wife, took a particular interest in Ayana. She was a small, energetic woman who had raised 5 children of her own and had plenty of maternal instinct left over. "That young man thinks very highly of you," she said one evening as they prepared dinner together. "Jake has been very kind," Ayana replied, focusing on the vegetables she was chopping. "Kind, yes, but it's more than that. He looks at you like you're something precious." Ayana felt her cheeks warm. She had noticed the way Jake's eyes lingered on her sometimes, but she had attributed it to concern rather than affection. "I am I do not think he could care for someone like me." Mrs. Patterson set down her mixing bowl and turned to face her. "Child, what exactly do you think is wrong with you?" "I am weak. I cannot do the things other women can do. I bring shame to those who care for me." "Who told you that?" "My people. They were right to leave me." Mrs. Patterson's expression grew fierce. "Your people were fools. You've been here 3 weeks, and already you've caught and corrected 2 major errors in the books that could have cost us hundreds of dollars. You've written letters that have secured us better prices for our cattle. You've organized the office in a way that actually makes sense." She paused. "And you've done all of this while learning to live in a completely different world from the one you knew. If that's weakness, I'll take it over strength any day." That evening, Ayana sat on the porch watching the sunset, thinking about Mrs. Patterson's words. She had been so focused on what she couldn't do that she had forgotten to value what she could do. "Mind if I join you?" Jake's voice came from behind her. She smiled and patted the space beside her on the porch swing. "I was hoping you would." Jake settled beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his body. "You've been quiet lately." "Everything." "All right. I have been thinking," she said, "about strength and weakness, about what makes a person valuable." "And what conclusion did you reach?" Ayana turned to look at him. This man who had literally carried her through the mountains and figuratively carried her into a new life. "I think I have been asking the wrong questions." "How so?" "I have been asking why I am not strong enough, instead of asking how I can use the strength I have." Jake smiled. "That's quite a revelation." I have you to thank for it. You showed me that I am not what they said I was. You gave me a chance to prove that I have value. I didn't give you anything, Jake said softly. I just helped you see what was already there. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the sky turn from orange to purple to deep blue. Jake, Ayanna said finally. Yeah. When I was on your back, climbing through the mountains, I was not thinking about being weak. I was thinking about being carried toward something better. Jake turned to face her fully. And what do you think? Now I think I am not being carried anymore. I think I am walking toward my own future. Jake's hand found hers, his fingers intertwining with hers. And what does that future look like? Ayanna smiled, feeling stronger and more hopeful than she had in years. I think it looks like home. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Ayanna realized that being rejected by her tribe had not been the end of her story. It had been the beginning. She had found her strength not in becoming someone else, but in accepting who she was and finding a place where that was enough. Jake had carried her through the mountains, but the journey to self-acceptance was one she had walked herself, and for the first time in her life, she felt truly strong. Epilogue 6 months later, the morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of the small cabin Jake had built on the Patterson property. Ayanna sat at the wooden desk by the window, carefully transcribing correspondence in her neat handwriting. The ledger books were balanced, the quarterly reports completed, and she had just finished negotiating a better price for feed with a supplier in town. All in perfect. ENGLISHA knock at the door interrupted her work. Jake entered, carrying a cup of coffee and wearing the smile that had become as familiar to her as breathing. How's the Empire running today? He asked, setting the coffee beside her papers. Very well, thank you. Mr. Patterson will be pleased with the new contracts. She gestured to the neat stack of documents. We saved nearly $200 on grain purchases this quarter. Jake whistled low. That's more than most cowboys make in a year. Ayanna felt a flush of pride. 6 months ago, she had been convinced she was worthless. Now she was an essential part of a thriving business, her skills valued and respected. There's something else, she said, turning to face him. I received a letter yesterday, from my cousin Swift Arrow. Jake's expression grew serious. What did he say? Word has reached them about where I am, what I'm doing. Some of the younger people in the tribe are curious. They've heard stories about the white man's ways of keeping records, of trading with paper instead of just goods. She paused. They want to learn. And what do you think about that? Ayanna stood and walked to the window, looking out at the mountains that had once seemed like an insurmountable barrier. I think perhaps my weakness has become my strength. I can bridge two worlds in a way that others cannot. Jake came to stand behind her, his hands resting gently on her shoulders. Mrs. Patterson mentioned something about starting a school, teaching reading and writing to the ranch hands' children. She did, and I've been thinking maybe it could be more than that. Maybe it could be a place where all children could learn, regardless of their heritage. It was a bold idea, perhaps even a dangerous one in these times. But Ayanna had learned that sometimes the most important things required courage. You know, I'll support whatever you decide, Jake said quietly. She turned in his arms, looking up at the man who had shown her that strength came in many forms. I know, and that's what makes me brave enough to try. Outside, the mountains stood eternal and unchanging. But Ayanna knew that she had been forever transformed by the journey through them. She had learned that being carried didn't make her weak, it had made her strong enough to carry others.